Now, again, another thing that all Buddhists do, and especially nowadays, this has become more important, but the question of lay practitioners, the early question of Buddhism, and I think I told you before that originally when Buddhism came about, that the job of lay people was to support the monks and then a little bit later the nuns, support the monastic community. And that was seen as, a way you build your karma up, and then, next life or so, a couple lives down the line, you get to actually be a monk or nun, and then you get to actually have a chance to get enlightened, right? And that's sort of the original way of looking at it. But then what happened early on is people realized, no, lay people could practice this too. Lay people can practice too. And you see this again when we get to, especially when we get to the Mahayana and the Vajrayana schools, we see a real increase in the representation of lay practitioners. Lay practitioners become very, very important. And this, I think, in my opinion, this culminates with Tibetan Buddhism. Because in Tibetan Buddhism, lay practitioners are really not seen as any better or worse than monastic practitioners. And you have, in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, you have quite a few individuals who are essentially lay practitioners, who become enlightened and become great teachers, and you see this throughout the history of Tibet. And by lay practitioners, I mean basically people who live as householders, people who get married, who have kids, who have families, and yet are also able to practice Buddhism at this very, very high level. And Tibetan Buddhism is rife with stories of these individuals. And some of the greatest teachers in the history of Tibetan Buddhism are lay teachers. Now, you also have great teachers, great individuals who are also monastic. And you also find this. You also have in Tibetan Buddhism a history and a tradition of enlightened female teachers, women who become enlightened, who teach and become, in some cases they marry or become the consort of one of these great male teachers, but then in their own right become enlightened and go off and teach on their own. And you have this tradition in Tibet. So again, the lay people become important. And you can imagine why this would be the case. Because it becomes very practical. If the only thing I can do as a Buddhist is to basically donate money to the monastery and get some good karma that way, that really doesn't, that's really not going to probably fulfill a lot of my own spiritual needs. That I need spiritual guidance. I need to try to be working on my spirituality. If I'm just, basically supporting the monks and nuns, that's not much juice in that for me, right? But if I can get in there and I can actually do some of the practice, I can try to follow the Eightfold Path. I can try to do it in this form, especially the last three, the meditation forms. If I can do some of that as a layperson, then now, now there's more traction for me to be a Buddhist. And I think as Buddhism has expanded, that lay people have become more and more involved with it and have been seen more and more as able to actually achieve stuff, be able to practice Buddhism. And so lay people, and nowadays, lay people are very important. Not a lot of people in the modern world have time to become monks or nuns, full-time monks or nuns. And so most of the Buddhists who practice in the West are lay people, okay? And you can maybe take some vows or maybe take some vows for a period of time. There's also been lots of experimentation with ways to do, especially the more intensive practices, and we're seeing some of that now. So lay people have become, in my opinion, more and more important in the Buddhist tradition. Okay? Now, what is the fundamental thing you do as a layperson? What is the fundamental bottom line for being a lay Buddhist practitioner? Okay? The fundamental bottom line is that you would follow these 5 lay precepts. And when you officially become a Buddhist, here are the precepts that you take. Not to harm or kill living beings, and I would put in there especially not to intentionally harm or kill living beings. Not to steal or take what is not given, not to cause harm through sexual behavior, not to cause harm through speech, not to cause harm through the use of alcohol or drugs. Okay? So again, for Buddhists, the interpretation of these is really up to you. Okay? You know, you may be in a culture that's extremely homophobic, and so for you not to cause harm through sexual behavior may say, oh, I can't have any gay sex, right? And there are some cultures where Buddhism is present that have rules like that. But that is not really, that does not come from Buddhism. Buddhism fundamentally doesn't care if you have sex with same-sex people, opposite sex, group sex. None of that's written down, okay? The idea is that you don't create drama and more bad karma through your sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is very, emotionally laden. It's got the high potential to cause drama, and so again, whatever you're going to do sexually, do it in a way that is responsible and doesn't cause trauma. Okay? That's the Buddhist view. Now, the cultures that Buddhism has found itself in may have various interpretations of this. They can be homophobic, they can be all sorts of things, but that doesn't come from Buddhism. Did you have a question? Question? No? All right. Speech, we know about this. And again, this idea of using harm through drugs or alcohol, some Buddhists would say that means no drinking, no getting high whatsoever. Alcohol shall never touch your lips, etc., etc., etc. Other ones are like, no, it just means that I don't want to get drunk, because if I get drunk, I make bad decisions and I make bad karma. It doesn't mean I can't have a glass of wine with my dinner. I have a friend of mine who's a very, very good Buddhist practitioner, very advanced practitioner, and he keeps a wine cellar. He likes really fine wine, he collects really good wine, and he has a glass with dinner. For him, he's not violating that precept. Okay, so again, there's a lot of room here for individual interpretation. And of course, that room for individual interpretation also has a bad side, that you can rationalize breaking these precepts. But again, for Buddhists, that's on you. That's on you. You got to develop enough insight that you know when you're rationalizing, or when you know when you shouldn't be doing something. So there is this sense in Buddhism about, that you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You're the one who is ultimately responsible for your behavior. And nobody can really tell you, what is good and bad. You have to figure that out. You have to do a little work here. Okay? And so Buddhism is a system that is about your own individual effort. I can't say, well, I'm going to go out and get wasted tonight, but tomorrow I'll give, $1,000 to the Buddhist church, and that'll absolve me of, of my night of drunkenness. No, it doesn't work that way in Buddhism. It doesn't work that way. Yes?
What about your friend that is a boxer?
Yeah? Say it again?
Your friend that is a boxer?
Yeah, well, he's a Thai boxer, so he's a sport boxer. He's not killing anybody.
He's
harming. He would make a case that, a Buddhist case that, by the way, he's not a Buddhist. He doesn't identify as being, he's a Western guy. He would argue that what he's doing here is he's engaging in a sport. There's a chance you can get injured in the sport. But, whether you win or lose the fight, if you get injured, you're also providing, traditionally in Thailand, you'd be providing for your family. You're doing a good thing, and it's through the sport, and you're not killing any other person in the sport. You're just doing it's a sport. It's like playing football or anything else, right? That would be, and so again, you see in Thailand, Thai boxing is incredibly popular. Is it dangerous? Yes. Do people get injured? Yes. Could you see that as a contradiction of Buddhist ideas? Yes, of course. Okay. Yes.
But they're both aware.
But they're both aware. I mean, they're consenting adults. They're going into this in their own way, to do this. They're not intending to, maim or injure the other person really severely. They're doing it as a spectacle, as a sport. And so I think that's the rationalization for it. So again, you might be a boxer and you might say, no, I've come to the level of Buddhism where even, people enjoying watching other people fighting, I don't think is a good thing, so I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm sure that's probably happened. But you have to you as an individual have to make the choice. Okay? Nobody can really make that for you in Buddhism. Okay? It does really require this bit of self-insight, that you really need to work on your capacity for reflecting on yourself. Even in the eightfold path, that first one, right understanding, you need to put the work in just to think, what's going on here? If you're a person who never thinks about what's going on or what you're doing, you just go through life just acting and reacting to things, you know, the first thing in Buddhism is they're going to break you of that habit where you really start, wait a second, I need to think about this. I need to think this through. In fact, I would say that the ability to develop the capacity to think through things a little bit is almost, for me, is almost a prerequisite to being a Buddhist practitioner. Very difficult to be a Buddhist practitioner if you just react and just act in life and don't think about things. Very difficult. Very difficult. Maybe impossible. Okay. All right. So I talked about this, difference between Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism. Again, this is a picture of Kuan Yin. Kuan Yin is found typically in Mahayana Buddhism in places like China. And Kuan Yin is essentially a representation of a bodhisattva. Okay, bodhisattva. And she is the one who's going to help all others before she is finally enlightened. And you see these bodhisattva figures, female form and male form. What's the name again? This is Kuan Yin. It's the Chinese name, okay, Kuan Yin. And we'll see some of the Tibetan versions of her in a little bit. She's, and I think in Japan she's Kwanon. And you see male and female versions. And she's very popular. It kind of analogous in Christianity, kind of to Virgin Mary, right? That again, you know, if you're in trouble, things are going badly for you, you know, you call out to her, you know, and she will come and help you, because that's her job as a bodhisattva. Yes?
So is she considered another version of Tara? Or,
yes, Tara is a version of her. Tara, they're related to each other. But also Chinrizik, who's also in Tibetan, the male god of deity of compassion. Yes, you know. So again, when the Tibetans sort of, they have their iconography is drawn directly out of Hinduism, as where this iconography may have had some Hindu stuff origination, but now becomes very much adapted to the local culture. So Kuan Yin, you know, very adapted to China, and then of course Kwanon in Japan, you know, becomes localized, right? So they localize her in China to this figure. But she's the bodhisattva, so she's there to help you. Okay, so she's the one you call on when you're in trouble. This is the Potala Palace in Tibet. I'm going to talk a lot about this. We're going to Tibetan Buddhism. But again, one thing you see here, notice the Buddhist symbols here. Notice these deer here. Why are these deer here? Because the Buddha's first sermon was done in the deer park. Okay, the deer park. And so the deer there, and here's the wheel of Eightfold Path, representing the teachings of the Buddha. And so this represents essentially Buddha's first sermon that he gives here. The palace. You also see these figures here. Some of these are prayer wheels or stupas. And you see the monastery, the Tibetan monastery. Now we're going to talk more about these. Now, let's look at maps, because you guys know I love maps, right? So I'm going to single-handedly reverse the American geographic illiteracy. At least you're going to know a little bit about Asia, right? So this is India. Okay, this is China. This now, which is now including China, this area here is Tibet. So down here is Malaysia, Thailand. Down here, which you can't see, is Indonesia. Here's Japan, here's Korea, Philippines, Pakistan, Afghanistan. The other stands over here. This would be Iran. This would be Iraq over here, right? Here's the little country of Nepal. Here's the little country of Bhutan right here. By the way, Bhutan is the last traditional Tibetan, Buddhist, Tibetan cultural kingdom left on the planet. Bhutan is a very little country. It is still run according to Tibetan Buddhist principles. It's a Tibetan culture, and it is very tiny. And you can go there. They only let in about 300 people a year, mostly for tours, and you can go there and actually experience what it would be like to have been in old Tibet. That's the best place you can go. Of course, the Tibetan government in exile is right on here in India, in a place called Ladakh, up here in India, right in there. And you can go there and see sort of Tibetan government in exile, but that will not give you an idea of what it was like to live in old Tibet. Because Tibetan government in exile, you know, the Dalai Lama modernized the government, there's a parliament, there's a president, all these kind of things. I'll talk a little bit about that later. So this is the map. This typical Buddha statue here. Again, I was going to talk here about the different types of meditation. So again, you see the Buddha in this posture. This is a sitting posture meditation here. We'll see variations of this. We'll talk that insight video. And again, you know, Buddhism, when you meditate, you have a choice. Okay, you have a choice usually of having your eyes half open or your eyes half closed. Somebody got the joke. You have a choice. Actually, depending on the school of Buddhism, you can have your eyes half open, or you can have your eyes completely closed, or in some instances, you can have your eyes completely open. But the typical sort of average is eyes half open or half closed. Yes?
And going back, why did China take over Tibet but leave Bhutan alone?
Bhutan is, my understanding, Bhutan is very difficult to get to. It's in the mountains, you gotta climb over mountains, yeah, it's not worth it. So they got, whatever reason, I don't know if they were, British may have ran it before, I don't know the history of that, I should check that. But they got left alone. China didn't go in and bug them. It's a little tiny place. All right, this is a typical meditation posture you're gonna see here. This is like a typical thing you especially see in Zen meditation where left hand and the right hand, thumbs are touching. This is called the dhyana posture. Dhyana means meditation. Okay. And this is the typical posture here. And we'll talk more about this. I don't know why that's there. And again, you see, if you see these Buddha statues, you'll see various things. We're going to talk about the symbolism of the hand postures, the so-called hand mudras, in a bit. And there's some very interesting, actually, research that just came out of this about these hand postures. Just came out from Japan, from a study of people who practice ninjutsu. And the ninjutsu, the ninjas of Japan, the actually original ninjas, actually practice a form of Buddhism called Tendai Buddhism. And in that, they do all these very elaborate hand mudras, and they do these things. They just did a study on this, and they found that actually hand mudras, if you do these hand mudras, there's all sorts of psychological benefits. So it's an interesting study. So if I remember, I'll try to bring that in and show you guys. It's quite fascinating. Okay, so timelines are good. So you should know a little bit about timelines, about when things happen. So this is not a complete timeline. It's obviously very sketchy, but just to show you here, here's Buddha's life. 560 to 480 BC around here. Again, in the BCE era, Buddhism spreading. This should be 275 BCE. 65, think about, you know, this area. Beginning Mahayana, about 100. Theravada Buddhism goes to Southeast Asia, about 675. Also at this time goes to China. It really catches on in China. It goes to China around in this time, early on, but it really catches on around 500 in China. It really starts to catch on. That's when you have the Shaolin Temple, things like this. And again, when you take my other class, the 436 class, those of you taking it, you know, I talked about the Shaolin Temple, and that was a Chan temple. In about 700 to 1100, Buddhism goes to Tibet, and this is about the time that Buddhism gets destroyed in India. In about 1200, Buddhism is transmitted from China to Japan. That actually is not true. Buddhism comes to Japan much earlier, around 600 or so, but does not catch on. And really, the flowering of Buddhism in Japan, really the introduction, the great expansion of the Zen Buddhist school happens around 11 or 1200. Okay. Now, more recent history, how does Buddhism come into the West? Henry David Thoreau, you guys may have known about him because when you were in high school you had to read a book about his life on Walden Pond. By the way, you can still go to Walden Pond, it's just outside of Boston, take a nice walk around, very beautiful place. Thoreau wrote this book. He also translated and published a Buddhist sutra. The sutras, remember, are the teaching of the Buddha. 1893, there's a World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, and they included Buddhists. In the early 1900s, the first Zen master comes to the United States as a permanent resident. As you know, lots of Japanese came around the turn of the century. What were the Japanese doing here around the turn of the century, especially relevant to our local history? What were they doing here? What did Japanese people come to America to do? What?
Gold rush.
Now, the Chinese came for the gold rush, and they were brought over almost like slave labor. That was earlier, right? That's a very bad piece of American history. Chinese are not treated very well.
Was it the war?
No? What were they coming over to do? And they came to Hawaii, too, by the way. Not to fish. Farm workers. Right? You think farm workers come all from south of the border, right? And that's true. A lot of farm workers come south of the border. But the early 1900s, lots of Japanese came over to the United States to be farm workers, and especially started in Hawaii. They brought them over to work the sugar plantations, do things in Hawaii, and then they came to California. And they came here, Oxnard, to farm strawberries and things and be farm workers. And then they established communities here, such that's why do you think we have a Buddhist church in Oxnard? Because there were Japanese immigrants that came here, and their descendants are still around. Okay, so lots of Japanese came here. Okay. 1935, the 14th Dalai Lama, this is the current Dalai Lama who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, he was born. 1950s, you had a lot of beat poets, Alan Watts, people very influenced by Buddhism, and you start having the first Tibetan Buddhist teachers coming to the United States. 1965, you have the Theravadins coming to the United States, the founding of the Theravadin Buddhist group. By the 1970s, you start having all sorts of more Buddhists coming in, an expansion of Zen, of Tibetan Buddhists, lots of Tibetan Buddhist teachers coming over, and now the first Western trained Tibetan Buddhist teachers. People like Chogyam Rinpoche and Sogyal Rinpoche, who were actually trained, went to college in England, and could speak English at a near native level, coming to the West and establishing schools of Tibetan Buddhism here. Okay? And again, this just keeps going, and again, Buddhism has become very popular, especially in places like California. Right? If you get out to the middle of Nebraska somewhere, you won't see too many Buddhists. But even in these places now, there's some interest in Buddhism. It's really become quite popular in the United States. Now, when we talk about the spread, I need to get some more maps. So again, these dates are approximate. So they may not agree with, you may see the date on one slide and not on the other. They're approximate. Theravadin Buddhism goes out of India, right around, somewhere in this area, 500 BC to 100. 100 AD, Buddhism also goes to China. Initial Buddhism goes to China, but doesn't really stick there for a while. Another map here. You see Buddhism going down here very early, out of India down to Sri Lanka, and then to Burma and Thailand. You see Buddhism going into Tibet around 800 or so AD, but only really is a firm foothold by 1100. Goes to China, 1st and 2nd centuries, but again, doesn't really stick until 400 or 500 AD, or AD or Common Era, the same thing, right? You guys know that. Was this class or the class I talked to you about that? AD means after death, CE means Common Era. After the death of Christ, we don't try to make religious references anymore, so now we say Common Era.
Anno Domini.
What's that?
Anno Domini.
Anno Domini, right. I always think after death, but yes, it's Anno Domini, same thing. Buddhism gets up to Korea, 4th and 5th centuries. Japan, again, early on, okay, but doesn't really flourish until about 500 years later, around 1000, 1100, 1200. Again, another map, same idea here. So that's just for your reference. Another map. All right. So let's talk a little bit about religion in the world, to put things in perspective here. First of all, what is the biggest religion in the world? Has the most followers in the entire world? What?
Christianity.
Christianity. About 33% of the people in the world are Christians. So if you're a Christian, congratulations, you are part of the biggest religion known to the planet. And this includes anybody who identifies themselves as a Christian. So your kind of Christianity may not recognize these other people as being Christian, okay, and vice versa. But if we take all the people who call themselves Christians and lump them all together, we have about 33%. And in a way that makes sense, right? Because Christianity is what kind of religion? What do you do in many kinds of Christianity? What do you try to do? Convert people. It's a proselytizing religion. You proselytize. You go out and spread the good word and you try to get new converts. Okay? And when you become a Christian, my understanding is that that means you really probably, for most Christian schools, once you become a Christian, you really can't be something else. I can't call myself a Christian and say I also follow Islam. It's most Christian schools. Right? I got to say, no, I'm Christian. I know those other schools may be fine, but is that right? I'm assuming some of you guys are Christians. Is that right? And again, you'll find variations of this. My friend opened a yoga studio in Camarillo, and then people came down and told her that was devil worship. Right? She had to explain, no, it's not. It's just exercise. But some people, some Christian groups are more tolerant of other groups than others. And again, a lot of the Christians don't. Some people don't consider, for instance, Latter-day Saints, Mormons, to be Christians, proper Christians. Some don't consider Jehovah's Witnesses to be proper Christians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever you want to. That's a lot, 33%. About 18% are Islam. Islam is the second biggest religion, and it is very quickly growing. Again, Islam is also a proselytizing religion. Seeks to convert followers, and I think, as I told you a few minutes ago, the place where Islam is going the quickest is Southeast Asia, Indonesia, something like 330 million people down there. It's going very quickly. Now the next categories are very interesting, because we're going to call this here, we're going to call this, I believe this is Chinese, this is Hinduism. So quite a lot of Hindus. Okay, well, that makes sense, right? Because almost 1 billion people in India. So you think and there's a lot of Hindus outside of India. So pretty big here. Then we come to this area. This is interesting. This we might call people who say none, agnostic, secular, humanist, atheist, etc. Pretty large group. But then we can also look over here, and we have Chinese traditional, and we also have indigenous and other. This is an interesting group, because if you live in a country like, let's say, communist China, where for the past 50 years, the state religion has been essentially atheism. Wasn't it Mao that said, religion is the opiate of the masses? And somebody comes to survey you to see what religion you are, what are you likely to tell them? Oh, I'm not religious, right? Because if you are religious, that could get you in trouble. Now, they've softened up on that a bit in China. That there are now, I think, 5 state-approved religions, or 3, which is some forms of Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism. Islam is one, and some problems with that. There's another one too in there somewhere. Maybe it's Confucianism, whatever. But traditionally there have been. So a lot of these people are Chinese. That's why it's such a big number, right? A lot of these folks are Chinese. Well, even though they say they're atheists, many of their beliefs and their practices are going to be related to Buddhism, and Taoism too, by the way. And most all of them Confucianism. I'm going to talk about Taoism and Confucianism later. So this group is going to include a lot of people who have a lot of Buddhist beliefs and practices. This group, Chinese traditional. going to include a lot of Buddhist stuff because a lot of it's infiltrated by now into the traditional Chinese. And this group, other, may include people in China. You know, so we look at Buddhism as 6% here. Traditional Buddhists, you know, people who identify themselves as Buddhists, 6% of the world population. But the but is that it may include a lot of this 8% and a lot of this 16%. So if you look at all the people who have Buddhist beliefs, who have some Buddhist kind of Buddhist practices, Buddhism really might be, some form of Buddhism may be running sort of in second place as far as the number of numbers. Now I'm not trying to rationalize and say Buddhism is, you know, the second most popular religion, but you could make some case that some sort of Buddhist beliefs or practices are held by, you know, 24% of people out there in the world, which is quite a lot. Okay? Doesn't mean that they're practicing Buddhism. But again, you find Buddhism here, and the other one. I've got another slide. You can see some of the other here. Again, you see Christianity. The other one's here. Buddhism is here. You see the others. And you get down to these others here, you know, and there's really, they really break it down here. Here you see Judaism, by the way, down here. And you think, oh, you know, there's Jewish people everywhere, right? You know, Judaism is just taking over the world. If you're anti-Semitic, you say, oh, the Jews are running the world, all this kind of conspiracy theory stuff. But when you actually look at the number of Jewish people in the world, there's not that many. Okay? Just a side note. You see all these down here, and then you get real other here, you get all these other little religions here. You know, neo-pagan druids, about a million. Scientologists, 750,000. I'm assuming probably 700,000 of those people live in LA. I may not be wrong about that. And Rastafarians, about 700,000 Rastafarians. I, you know, there. Okay. I don't know if that includes people who go to Burning Man as well, who identify as Rastafarians, who may or may not have anything to do with traditional Rastafarianism. But there you have it. So again, take a look at this, and this is an interesting thing. This puts things in perspective here. Right? This map's getting a little old now, but if you want to look at where you find Buddhism in America, you can look here. Where are the two places you have the most Buddhism in America? Surprise, surprise, surprise.
New York and
California and New York. Okay. Well, that's not surprising. You know, that's the east and left coast. But what is more surprising to me is you actually have some fair number amount of Buddhists in Texas and in what's this, Kansas?
No,
But Kansas, what is that?
that's oh god.
Nevada,
Nevada,
Utah?
Colorado.
Colorado. Sorry, Colorado. Colorado's got a big Buddhist center. They have a Buddhist university in Colorado.
None in Wyoming or the Dakotas.
Yeah, none in Wyoming. But you know, this change, I heard now they have some centers up here. Some Tibetan Buddhists are built monasteries up here because it reminds them of Tibet. It's cold and isolated. So there's probably a few. I lived in Illinois for a while here. There was almost very little Buddhism in Illinois. Now there's more. So again, you see it growing here. Since Hawaii's got lots of good Buddhism. We took a students on a tour of Hawaii a few years ago, and you would not believe all the Buddhist places we found in Hawaii. I mean, it was like, it's everywhere in Hawaii. It's amazing. It's just hidden. You don't normally go to Hawaii and go look for Buddhism, right? But if you go and you look for it, oh man, it's just everywhere. I mean, we found Buddhist stuff all over the place. Anybody been to Maui? Been to Maui, you go to Lahaina, which is the real touristy part of Maui, you know, a real super touristy place. A block off the main street in Lahaina is a wonderful, wonderful Shingon Buddhist temple, Japanese Shingon Buddhist temple. You know, I mean, just sitting there, you know, and nobody, Westerners never go there, right? We went there and they were just overjoyed, thrilled. The guy didn't even speak any English. The priest barely spoke any English. I mean, Hawaii is an amazing place to go for Buddhism. Oh. And again, you see lots of Westerners practicing Buddhism. Now, you know, this is white males. So dare I say that the people who originally, you know, the Westerners who, you know, probably first got interested in Buddhism in America were probably more or less white males. This has changed now. Now if you go to a Buddhist center, you're going to see much more diversity, which I think is great. You know, you'll see African Americans, you'll see Latinos, you'll see, you know, what America looks like. I mean, like this classroom, you look around, you know, you will not just see just white male faces. You'll see women, you'll see lots of different kinds of people. And this is great. And this is really what, as I'm trying to get across in this class, this is one of the great innovations of Buddhism, that anybody can practice, that we're all human beings. You know, that being a human being is a very precious thing, and that it doesn't matter what kind of human being you are, you know, that you are more than welcome to come and practice Buddhism. Okay, I think I'm going to leave that there. Why don't we take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll start talking about Tibetan Buddhism.